I was wiping down the last wrench when I heard it, a soft knock on the glass door that barely registered above the hum of the fluorescent lights. The clock on the wall read 6:47 p.m., and I'd already flipped the sign to "closed" 20 minutes ago. My back ached from hunching over engines all day, and all I wanted was to lock up and head home to a cold beer and whatever game was on television. But something about that knock made me pause. It wasn't the impatient rap of someone demanding service, or the confident knock of a regular customer who knew I'd bend the rules. This was different, hesitant, almost apologetic. I looked up from my toolbox and saw him through the smudged glass, a small silhouette against the amber glow of the streetlights. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding something that looked like a bicycle wheel. His shoulders were narrow, almost fragile, and he stood perfectly still, as if afraid that moving might make him disappear. For a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't heard. It had been a long day, and I'd already dealt with 3 difficult customers, a transmission that fought me for 4 hours, and a parts delivery that never showed up. The last thing I needed was some kid asking me to fix his bike for pocket change. But then I saw his face more clearly through the glass. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he wasn't crying. There was something in his expression, a kind of quiet desperation mixed with hope, that made my chest tighten. I'd seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago when I was about his age. I walked to the door, my work boots echoing in the empty garage. The boy didn't move as I approached, didn't shift his weight or fidget the way kids usually do. He just stood there, holding that broken bike like it was made of glass. I unlocked the door and opened it halfway. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of someone's fireplace. The boy looked up at me with those serious, dark eyes, and I noticed his clothes, a faded blue jacket that was too big for him, jeans with a small tear at the knee, sneakers that had seen better days. "We're closed, son," I said, but my voice came out gentler than I'd intended. He nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "I know, sir." "I saw the sign, but my dad—" His voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "My dad's in heaven now. Can you still fix my bike?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, one hand on the doorframe, staring down at this kid who had just delivered the most heartbreaking sentence I'd heard in years. My mind went blank for a moment, searching for the right response, the appropriate words of comfort that might help. But what do you say to a child who's lost his father? What could possibly make that better? I looked at the bicycle he was holding. It was a small BMX bike, red and black, with training wheels that had been removed. The front wheel was bent, the handlebars were twisted, and the chain hung loose like a broken promise. It was the kind of damage that comes from a serious crash, not just a tumble in the driveway. "Did your dad used to bring you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. His lower lip trembled, but he pressed it firmly together. "Every Saturday. He said I'd ride again soon. He said you were the best mechanic in town." And then it hit me. I remembered this bike. I remembered the father, a quiet man in his 30s with calloused hands and kind eyes. Daniel Miller, that was his name. He'd been bringing this bike in for months, always on Saturdays, always with his son in tow. The boy, Tommy, I think his name was, would sit on the wooden stool in the corner watching me work, asking questions about tools and engines and how things worked. Daniel had been patient with his son, never rushing him, never dismissing his questions. He'd explain things simply, encourage the boy to watch and learn. I remembered thinking that Daniel was the kind of father I wished I'd had, present, engaged, proud of his kid. The last time I'd seen them was maybe 3 weeks ago. Daniel had brought the bike in for a tune-up, and Tommy had been excited about finally getting his training wheels off. They'd been planning to spend the weekend practicing in the park, Daniel holding the back of the seat while Tommy found his balance. When did he— I couldn't finish the question. 2 weeks ago," Tommy said quietly. "Car accident. He was coming home from work. I felt something break inside my chest. This kid had lost his father, and the bike, their last shared project, was broken too. It was too much for one small person to carry." I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, buddy. Let's make it right again." Tommy's face lit up for the first time since he'd arrived. He wheeled the bike through the doorway, and I noticed how carefully he maneuvered it, how he avoided bumping it against the frame. This wasn't just a bike to him. It was a connection to his father, a tangible piece of their relationship. I turned on the overhead lights, and the garage came alive with the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. Tommy looked around with wide eyes, taking in the tools hanging on the pegboard, the cars in various states of repair, the coffee can full of bolts and screws on my workbench. "I remember this place," he said softly. "Dad always said it smelled like hard work and honest living." I smiled, despite myself. That sounded like something Daniel would say. He'd had a way of finding poetry in practical things, of making the ordinary seem special. I wheeled the bike over to my workstation and lifted it onto the repair stand. Under the bright lights, the damage was more extensive than I'd initially thought. The front wheel wasn't just bent, it was cracked in 2 places. The handlebars were twisted so badly that the steering tube might be compromised. The chain was broken, not just loose. The rear derailleur was hanging by a thread. This wasn't a simple repair, this was a complete rebuild. I glanced at Tommy, who was watching me examine the bike with the same intense focus I'd seen in his father. He seemed to understand that this was serious damage, that it would take time and skill to fix. "It's pretty beat up," I said carefully. "What happened?" Tommy's shoulders sagged. "After the funeral, I tried to ride it. I wanted to feel close to Dad, you know. But I crashed, hard. I forgot how to balance without the training wheels." I nodded, understanding flooding through me. This kid had lost his father and then broken the one thing that connected them. No wonder he looked so defeated. "The good news," I said, "is that everything here can be fixed. It's going to take some work, but we can make it better than new." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? You can fix it?" "I can fix it. But it's going to take a few hours? Are you sure you want to wait?" He nodded eagerly. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Mom's working late tonight. She's been working a lot lately." I felt another pang of sympathy. This kid was dealing with loss. His mother was probably struggling financially, and he was spending his Saturday evening in a garage instead of playing video games or watching cartoons. "All right then," I said, rolling up my sleeves. "Let's get to work." "More." I started by removing the front wheel, explaining each step to Tommy the way his father might have. I showed him how to use the quick-release lever, how to thread the wheel out of the brake calipers, how to be gentle with the components. "Your dad was teaching you about bikes, wasn't he?" I asked as I worked. Tommy nodded. "He said knowing how to fix things was important. He said too many people throw things away when they could be repaired." I smiled. That was definitely something Daniel would say. He'd been the kind of customer who wanted to understand what was wrong with his car, who asked questions and listened to the answers. As I worked on the wheel, I found myself telling Tommy stories about his father, how Daniel had once spent an entire Saturday helping me diagnose a problem with my air compressor, even though he was paying me to work on his car, how he'd always brought me coffee when he knew I was working late. How he'd talked about Tommy constantly, proudly sharing stories about his son's accomplishments and dreams. "He was proud of you," I said, truing the spokes on the new wheel I'd pulled from my parts inventory. "He talked about you all the time." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I miss him. I miss riding bikes with him. I miss everything." I stopped working and looked at the kid. He was sitting on the stool where he'd sat so many times before, but now he looked smaller, more fragile. The loss was written all over his face, in the way he held his shoulders, in the careful way he spoke, in the sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from an engine. Missing him is normal, I said. It means you loved him. And love doesn't go away just because someone does. Tommy nodded, but I could see tears starting to form in his eyes. Sometimes I forget he's gone. I'll think of something I want to tell him, and I'll turn around expecting him to be there. I knew that feeling. I'd lost my own father when I was 17, and even now, 20 years later, I sometimes found myself picking up the phone to call him before remembering he wouldn't answer. That's normal too, I said. It means he's still with you in a way. In your memories, in the things he taught you, in the way he loved you. I went back to work on the wheel, but I kept talking, sharing memories of Daniel, stories that made Tommy smile. I told him about the time his father had insisted on paying for a homeless man's car repair, how he'd quietly slipped me the money and asked me not to make a big deal about it. I told him about the day Daniel had brought in a birthday cake for me, just because he'd remembered me mentioning it was my birthday. He was a good man, I said, and he raised a good son. Tommy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I wish I could be more like him. You already are. You're brave, you're kind, and you don't give up. That's all him. As I worked, I found myself thinking about my own father, about the things he'd taught me in this very garage. He'd been a mechanic too, and he'd shown me that fixing things was about more than just tools and parts. It was about patience, about understanding, about taking something broken and making it whole again. The front wheel was coming together beautifully. I'd replaced the cracked rim, trued the spokes, and adjusted the brake pads. The wheel spun smooth and true, ready to carry Tommy safely down the road. Next, I tackled the handlebars. The steering tube was bent, but not broken, and I was able to straighten it with careful pressure and some heat. I replaced the handlebars themselves, choosing a set that was slightly wider than the originals. Tommy was growing, and he'd need the extra control. "Why do you do this?" Tommy asked as I worked on the brake cables. "Fix things, I mean." I paused, considering the question. Because things that are broken don't have to stay broken. Because sometimes fixing something mechanical is easier than fixing something emotional. Because, I trailed off, then continued. Because my dad taught me that taking care of things shows respect. For the thing itself, and for the person who made it, or owned it, or loved it. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Dad said something like that once. He said fixing things was like giving them a second chance. Your dad was a wise man. I moved on to the chain, which required a complete replacement. As I fed the new chain through the derailleur, I explained how the gears worked, how the chain transferred power from the pedals to the wheels, how everything had to work together to make the bike move. "It's like a team," Tommy observed. "Every part has a job." Exactly. And when one part isn't working, the whole team suffers. But when everything's working together, I shifted through the gears, listening to the smooth click of the mechanism. Magic happens. By now, it was past 8 o'clock. The garage was warm from the heater I'd turned on, and the smell of fresh grease and metal polish filled the air. Tommy had been asking questions the entire time, and I'd been answering them the way his father would have, patiently, thoroughly, with respect for his curiosity. The bike was nearly finished. I'd replaced the damaged components, adjusted the brakes, lubricated the chain, and cleaned every surface until it gleamed. It looked better than it had when Daniel first brought it in months ago. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I went to my supply cabinet and pulled out a small bell, the kind that attaches to the handlebars. It was silver with a clear, bright tone when you flicked it with your finger. I'd been saving it for a special project, and this felt like the right time to use it. "What's that for?" Tommy asked. I attached the bell to the handlebars, right where Tommy's thumb would naturally rest. "Your dad always said safety first. This way people will hear you coming." Tommy reached out and rang the bell. The sound was pure and clean, cutting through the garage noise like a prayer. He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Dad would have loved this," he said. I made a few final adjustments, checking the tire pressure, testing the brakes, making sure everything was perfect. Then I lifted the bike off the repair stand and set it on the floor. "Want to try it out?" I asked. Tommy looked nervous. "What if I fall again?" "Then you get back up. That's what your dad would want you to do." I opened the large garage door that led to the alley behind the shop. The evening air was cool and crisp, and the alley was empty, except for a few parked cars and some garbage cans. It was the perfect place for a test ride. Tommy climbed onto the bike, and I could see his father in the way he gripped the handlebars, in the determined set of his jaw. He pushed off with his right foot, found the pedals, and started to wobble. For a moment, I thought he might fall. The bike weaved back and forth, and Tommy's face was tight with concentration. But then something clicked. His movements became smoother, more confident. The bike steadied, and he began to ride. He made it maybe 20 feet before he had to brake and put his foot down, but he was grinning from ear to ear. "I did it. I really did it." "You sure did. Your dad would be proud." Tommy rode back and forth in the alley for another 10 minutes, his confidence growing with each pass. He was still shaky, still learning to balance, but he was riding. The bike that had been broken was carrying him again, just like his father had promised it would. When he finally stopped, his cheeks were flushed with excitement and cold air. "Thank you," he said, looking up at me with those serious dark eyes. "Thank you for fixing it." I knelt down so we were at eye level. "You're welcome, buddy, but I want you to remember something. I didn't just fix your bike tonight. Your dad helped. He's the one who taught you to be brave, to not give up, to keep trying even when things are hard. That's what got you riding again." Tommy nodded, and I could see him processing this idea. "So he's still helping me?" "He's always going to be helping you. Every time you ride this bike, every time you fix something that's broken, every time you help someone else, that's him living on through you." We wheeled the bike back into the garage, and I helped Tommy figure out how to get it home. He lived only a few blocks away, and the bike was light enough that he could walk it if he got tired of riding. As we prepared to leave, Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. "Mom gave me this for you," he said. "She said to pay you for fixing it." I looked at the bill, then at Tommy. $5 wouldn't even cover the cost of the chain, let alone the wheel, the handlebars, and the hours of labor. But I could see that this was important to him, that paying for the repair was a matter of pride. "You know what?" I said. "Your dad and I had a deal. He helped me fix my air compressor, and I owed him a favor. This makes us even." Tommy looked confused. But Mom said, "Tell your mom that your dad already paid for this a long time ago. Tell her—" I paused, thinking about how to phrase it. "Tell her that some debts are paid with kindness, not money." Tommy nodded solemnly and put the $5 back in his pocket. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and hugged me. His arms barely reached around my waist, but his grip was tight and fierce. "Thank you," he whispered into my shirt. "Thank you for keeping Dad's promise." I hugged him back, feeling something in my chest crack open. This kid had lost his father, but he hadn't lost his faith in the world. He still believed that promises could be kept, that broken things could be fixed, that there were people who would help him when he needed it. "Your dad was lucky to have you," I said, "and you were lucky to have him." We stood there for a moment, this grieving boy and this middle-aged mechanic, connected by a shared loss and a repaired bicycle. Then Tommy pulled back, wiped his eyes, and climbed onto his bike. "I'll come back and visit," he said. "Maybe I can learn to fix things too." "I'd like that," I said. "Your dad would like that too." Tommy rang his bell once, a clear silver note that echoed off the garage walls. Then he pedaled out into the night, wobbling slightly, but moving forward, carrying his father's love with him. I watched him until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Then I stood in the doorway for a long time, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I thought about Daniel Miller, about the kind of man he'd been, about the son he'd raised. I thought about the promises we make to our children and how some promises transcend death. I thought about the power of fixing things, not just broken bicycles, but broken hearts, broken dreams, broken faith in the world. Somewhere above me, in the vast expanse of the October sky, I imagined Daniel looking down at his son, proud of the boy's courage, grateful for the kindness of strangers, satisfied that his promise had been kept. I raised my hand in a small salute to the stars, then turned and walked back into the garage. There were tools to put away, lights to turn off, doors to lock. But first, I sat down at my workbench and pulled out a small notebook where I kept track of repairs and parts. Under today's date, I wrote, "Tommy Miller, bicycle repair, no charge. Some debts are paid with kindness." Then I closed the notebook and began to clean up, humming softly to myself. Outside, the wind was picking up, rustling the leaves that had fallen from the old oak tree in the alley. But inside the garage, everything was warm and quiet and right. I had fixed a bicycle tonight, but more than that, I had helped keep a promise. I had shown a grieving child that there were still people in the world who cared, who would go out of their way to help, who understood that sometimes the most important repairs are the ones we make to each other's hearts. As I turned off the lights and locked the door, I thought about Tommy pedaling home through the October night, his father's love propelling him forward, his bell ringing clear and bright in the darkness. Some promises, I realized, are too important to break. Some repairs matter more than others, and sometimes fixing a broken bike is just the beginning of fixing a broken world. The stars were fully visible now, sharp and bright against the black sky. I stood there for a moment longer, thinking about fathers and sons, about loss and healing, about the way love persists even after death. Then I got in my truck and drove home, carrying with me the memory of a boy who had learned to ride again, and the knowledge that his father's promise had been kept. In the weeks that followed, Tommy would return to the garage several times. Sometimes he came with his mother, a tired but kind woman who thanked me repeatedly for my help. Sometimes he came alone, bringing his bike in for minor adjustments and staying to watch me work on other projects. I taught him to change a tire, to adjust brake cables, to clean and oil a chain. He was a quick learner, just like his father had been, and he approached each task with the same careful attention to detail that Daniel had possessed. His mother, Sarah, told me later that riding the bike had been a turning point for Tommy. It had given him confidence, a sense of connection to his father, and a belief that broken things could be made whole again. She said he talked about becoming a mechanic when he grew up, about fixing things for people who needed help. I thought about that conversation as I worked on other repairs, as I helped other customers, as I went about the daily business of keeping machines running and people moving. There was something profound about the idea that fixing one small boy's bicycle had rippled outward, creating waves of hope and healing that would continue long after the last bolt was tightened. Years later, when Tommy was in high school, he would get a part-time job at a bike shop across town. He would tell his boss about the night a mechanic had stayed late to fix his bike, about the promise that had been kept, about the way kindness could change everything. And someday, when Tommy was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them about their grandfather, about the man who had taught him that love doesn't end with death, that promises can be kept across the divide between life and whatever comes after. But all of that was in the future. That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, I was thinking about the present moment, about the simple act of fixing what was broken, about the way a child's courage had reminded me why I did this work in the first place. The radio was playing an old song, something about fathers and sons, and the way wisdom passes from one generation to the next. I hummed along, thinking about Daniel Miller and his boy, about the bicycle that had brought them together, and the promise that had kept them connected even after death. Some repairs, I realized, are about more than just making things work again. Sometimes they're about making things right. Sometimes they're about honoring the past while building a bridge to the future. Sometimes they're about showing a child that the world is still full of people who care, who will help, who understand that love is the most powerful force in the universe. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked up at the stars one more time. They seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was celebrating the small miracle that had taken place in my garage. A broken bike had been fixed, a grieving child had learned to ride again, and a promise had been kept. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't much, but sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the ones that matter most. Sometimes the most important repairs are the ones we make to each other's hearts. And sometimes, when we fix what's broken, we discover that we've been fixed too. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, remembering the sound of Tommy's bell ringing in the darkness, the sight of him pedaling away into the night, the feeling of his arms around my waist when he hugged me goodbye. These were the moments that made all the hard work worthwhile, the moments that reminded me why I had become a mechanic in the first place. Not just to fix engines and transmissions and bicycles, but to fix the connections between people, to keep the promises that matter, to show the world that broken things don't have to stay broken. As I walked to my front door, I thought about tomorrow, about the work that waited for me, about the customers who would bring their broken machines and their broken dreams to my garage. I thought about the boy who would probably stop by on his way home from school, eager to learn something new, carrying his father's love with him like a light in the darkness. And I smiled, knowing that I would be there to help, to teach, to keep the promises that needed keeping, because that's what mechanics do. We fix what's broken. We keep things running. We make sure the important promises are never forgotten. The stars were still shining as I unlocked my door and stepped inside. Behind me, the night was full of possibility, full of stories yet to be told, full of broken things waiting to be made whole again. And somewhere in the darkness, a boy was pedaling home on a bicycle that had been repaired with love, carrying his father's promise with him into the future. That night, I slept better than I had in months, dreaming of bicycle bells and star-filled skies, of fathers and sons and the promises that bind them together across time and space and death itself. And when I woke up the next morning, I was eager to get back to work, to continue the sacred art of fixing what was broken, one repair at a time. The following Monday arrived with the kind of autumn crispness that makes you pull your jacket tighter and walk just a little faster. I opened the garage earlier than usual, the familiar ritual of turning on lights and firing up the coffee pot serving as my morning meditation. But something felt different about this particular Monday. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, as if the weekend's encounter with Tommy had shifted something fundamental in the universe. I was organizing my tool chest when I heard the bell above the door chime. Looking up, I expected to see one of my regular customers, maybe Mrs. Henderson with her ancient Buick, or Jim Patterson bringing in his work truck for its monthly tune-up. Instead, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and tired eyes that seemed to carry the weight of recent struggles. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but determined. "Are you the mechanic who helped my son Tommy on Saturday night?" I set down the wrench I'd been holding and wiped my hands on my coveralls. "You must be Sarah. Tommy mentioned you." She stepped further into the garage, and I could see the resemblance between her and her son, the same dark eyes, the same quiet strength, the same way of holding themselves with dignity despite whatever hardships they'd faced. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, "not just for fixing the bike, but for everything. The way you treated him, the time you spent. Tommy hasn't stopped talking about it." She paused, her voice catching slightly. He hasn't been this excited about anything since Daniel died. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that came whenever I was reminded of the depth of loss this family had endured. He's a good kid, smart, brave. His father did a fine job raising him. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Daniel would have wanted to pay you properly. He never liked owing anyone anything. I shook my head. Tommy tried to pay me. I told him his father had already taken care of it, and I meant that. Daniel helped me out more than once. This just evens the score. She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether I was telling the truth or just being kind. Finally, she nodded. He was like that, always helping people. Sometimes I think he cared more about everyone else than he did about himself. That's what made him special, I said. That's what made him a good father. Sarah walked over to the workbench where I'd repaired Tommy's bike, running her fingers along the edge of the metal surface. This is where you fixed it? Right here. Tommy sat on that stool and watched the whole time. Asked 1,000 questions, just like his dad used to do. A smile flickered across her face. Daniel said you were patient with questions. He said that was the mark of a good teacher. Your husband was full of wisdom. She turned back to me, and I could see her wrestling with something, some decision she was trying to make. I've been thinking about what you said to Tommy, about promises being kept across death, about love not ending. I want to believe that, but she trailed off, then started again. It's hard to believe in anything when you're working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, when your 8-year-old son cries himself to sleep, when every morning you wake up and for just a split second you forget that your husband is gone. I set down my tools and really looked at her. This woman was drowning, struggling to keep her head above water while making sure her son didn't see her panic. She was trying to be strong for Tommy while falling apart inside, and the effort was exhausting her. "How are you holding up?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stared at me for a moment, then her composure cracked. "I'm not," she whispered. "I'm not holding up at all. I'm barely keeping it together. Half the time I don't know what I'm doing, and the other half I'm terrified I'm going to mess up Tommy's life even more than it already is." I walked over to the small refrigerator I kept in the corner of the garage and pulled out 2 bottles of water. I handed her one and gestured to the wooden stool where Tommy had sat. "You want to tell me about it?" She looked surprised by the offer, as if she'd forgotten that there were still people in the world who were willing to listen. Slowly, she sat down on the stool, clutching the water bottle like a lifeline. "Daniel handled everything," she began. "The bills, the car maintenance, the insurance, the taxes. He said I had enough to worry about with work and Tommy, that he wanted to take care of the practical stuff. I thought he was being sweet. But now," she shook her head, "I don't know how he did it all. I can barely keep track of what day it is." I leaned against the workbench, giving her my full attention. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a nurse at the hospital. 12-hour shifts, 3 days a week. It used to be enough when Daniel was working construction, but now I'm trying to pick up extra shifts wherever I can. The problem is, the more I work, the less time I have with Tommy, and he's already lost so much." I could hear the guilt in her voice, the impossible weight of trying to be everything to everyone while dealing with her own grief. "He seems like he's doing okay. Sad, obviously, but strong. He is strong. Too strong for an 8-year-old. He tries to take care of me, to make sure I'm okay. Last week I found him trying to balance our checkbook with a calculator he borrowed from school." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He shouldn't have to worry about grown-up things. He should be worried about homework and soccer and whether his friends like him." "Does he play soccer?" Sarah shook her head. "He used to. Daniel coached his team. But after the accident, I couldn't—" She paused, gathering herself. "I couldn't handle driving him to practices and games and tournaments. It was too much. So I told him we'd take a break, maybe start again next season. But I saw the disappointment in his eyes. I thought about Tommy, about his quiet strength, And his careful way of speaking. He was protecting his mother, trying not to add to her burden. It was admirable and heartbreaking at the same time. "What would Daniel want you to do?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise her. "What do you mean?" "If he could see you now, see you struggling, what would he want you to do? What would he tell you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the concrete floor. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clearer than they'd been since she'd walked in. "He'd tell me to ask for help," she said softly. "He'd tell me that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. He'd probably be frustrated that I've been so stubborn about accepting help from our families, from friends, from anyone. Why have you been stubborn about it?" She sighed. "Pride, I guess, and fear. I'm afraid that if I start depending on people, I'll never learn to stand on my own. I'm afraid that if I accept help, people will think I'm weak, that I can't take care of my son. Or maybe," I said gently, "you're afraid that if you let people help you, you'll have to admit that Daniel is really gone." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth. Sarah's face crumpled, and she began to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she'd been holding back, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. I didn't try to comfort her with words. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply witness someone's pain, to let them know that their grief is valid and their struggles are real. I handed her a clean shop rag and waited while she cried. When the tears finally subsided, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I miss him so much. I miss having a partner, someone to share the load. I miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who knew me well enough to know when I was pretending to be fine. That's what marriage is supposed to be," I said. "A partnership. You're trying to do the work of two people, and that's impossible. So what do I do? How do I learn to be a single parent when I've never had to be one before?" I thought about the question, about the practical realities of grief and loss and starting over. You start by accepting that you don't have to figure it all out at once. You start by letting people help you. You start by being as gentle with yourself as you would be with Tommy if he were struggling. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the shop rag. "Daniel's parents have been offering to help, but I've been too proud to accept. My sister lives across town and keeps asking if she can take Tommy for weekends, but I keep saying no because I feel like I should be able to handle everything myself. What would happen if you said yes? I don't know. I guess I'd have some time to breathe, to figure out how to manage the bills and the house and everything else without feeling like I'm neglecting Tommy. And Tommy would get to spend time with people who love him, who can share stories about his father and help him process his grief." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering this. "When you put it that way, it sounds like saying yes would be better for both of us. That's usually how it works. We think we're being strong by refusing help, but sometimes the strongest thing we can do is admit we need it." She smiled for the first time since she'd walked into the garage. "Daniel used to say something like that. He'd say that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of wisdom. Smart man. He was. I just wish he were here to help me figure out how to live without him." I understood that feeling. The paradox of grief was that the person you most needed to help you through it was the person you'd lost. But there was something else to consider. "Maybe he is helping you," I said. "Maybe he's helping you through the people he left behind, through his parents, through your sister, through the friends who keep offering to lend a hand. Maybe he's helping you through Tommy, who's showing you every day what strength and love look like." Sarah nodded slowly. "I never thought of it that way. Sometimes the people we lose keep loving us through the people who remain. Sometimes their final gift is the community they built around us, the relationships they nurtured, the love they planted that keeps growing even after they're gone." We talked for another hour about practical things and emotional things, about the challenges of single parenthood and the process of grief. Sarah told me about her fears and hopes, about the dreams she'd shared with Daniel, and the new dreams she was slowly beginning to imagine for herself and Tommy. When she finally left, she seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her burden had made it more manageable. She promised to call Daniel's parents that evening, to accept their offer of help with Tommy. She promised to talk to her supervisor about switching to a more predictable schedule, even if it meant slightly less money. Most importantly, she promised to be gentler with herself, to remember that healing takes time and that it's okay to not have all the answers. The next few weeks brought a parade of changes to the Miller family's life. Tommy started spending Wednesday evenings with his paternal grandparents, who had stories about Daniel's childhood and the patience to help with homework. Sarah's sister began picking Tommy up on Saturday mornings, taking him to soccer practice and games, bringing him back with grass stains on his knees and joy in his eyes. Sarah found a part-time job at a smaller clinic that offered more flexible hours, allowing her to be home when Tommy got off the school bus. The pay was less, but the stress was manageable, and she was sleeping better at night. Tommy continued to visit my garage, sometimes with his mother, sometimes alone. He was learning to change oil, to check tire pressure, to diagnose simple problems. But more than that, he was learning that there were adults in the world who cared about him, who would take time to teach him things, who would listen to his stories and his questions and his fears. One particularly busy Thursday afternoon, I was working on a transmission rebuild when I heard the familiar sound of Tommy's bicycle bell. I looked up to see him wheeling his bike through the garage door, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a girl about his age, with red hair in braids and a shy smile. "Mr. Jack," Tommy called out, using the name he'd started calling me after learning that everyone in town just called me Jack. "This is my friend Emma. She has a problem with her bike." Emma stepped forward, pushing a small purple bike with streamers on the handlebars. "The chain keeps falling off," she said quietly. "My mom says we can't afford to get it fixed." I wiped my hands on my coveralls and knelt down to examine the bike. The chain was indeed loose, and the derailleur needed adjustment. It was a simple fix, maybe 20 minutes of work. "I think I can help with that," I said. "But I'm going to need some assistance. Tommy, you want to be my helper?" Tommy's face lit up. "Really? I can help fix Emma's bike? You've been learning. Time to put that knowledge to use." For the next half hour, I guided Tommy through the process of adjusting the derailleur and tightening the chain. Emma watched with wide eyes as Tommy explained each step, his voice filled with the confidence that comes from understanding something complex. "My dad used to bring me here," Tommy told Emma as he worked. "He said Mr. Jack was the best mechanic in town. Now Mr. Jack is teaching me to be a mechanic too." When the repair was finished, Emma climbed onto her bike and rode it around the garage. The chain stayed in place, the gears shifted smoothly, and her smile was brighter than the fluorescent lights overhead. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her pocket. "Nothing," I said, "but I want you to promise me something. When you're older, when you see someone who needs help, you'll remember this day. You'll remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is help each other." Emma nodded seriously. "I promise." After the children left, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of kindness. Tommy had learned to fix bikes, but more importantly, he'd learned to help others. The grief that had once threatened to overwhelm him was being transformed into something else: compassion, strength, a desire to make the world a little bit better. That evening, as I was closing up the garage, Sarah stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. "I wanted to thank you," she said, settling onto the stool that had become her regular spot. "Not just for today, but for everything. Tommy told me about Emma's bike, about how you let him help with the repair. He was so proud. He did good work. He's got natural talent, just like his father." Sarah smiled. "He wants to be a mechanic when he grows up. He says he wants to help people the way you helped him." That's a fine ambition. The world needs more people who want to help. She poured coffee into 2 cups and handed me one. I've been thinking about what you said, about Daniel helping me through other people. I think you're right. His parents have been wonderful with Tommy, and my sister has been a godsend. But I think Daniel's biggest gift to me was bringing us to you. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't do anything special. You did everything special. You stayed late on a Saturday night to help a grieving child. You listened to an overwhelmed widow pour out her heart. You created a safe space for us to begin healing. She paused, sipping her coffee. Daniel always said that mechanics were the unsung heroes of the world. He said you keep everything running, that you fix what's broken. I never really understood what he meant until now. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the sounds of the evening. Distant traffic, the hum of the vending machine in the corner, the soft whistle of wind through the open garage door. I have something for you, Sarah said eventually, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small framed photograph and handed it to me. It was a picture of Daniel and Tommy, taken the last time they'd visited the garage. Daniel was kneeling next to Tommy's bike, pointing at something on the chain, while Tommy listened with rapt attention. Both of them were smiling, lost in the simple joy of shared learning. I found this on Daniel's phone, Sarah said. He took it the day before he died. I thought you should have it. I stared at the photograph, remembering that day clearly. Daniel had been teaching Tommy about bike maintenance, and I'd been working on a customer's car nearby. It had been an ordinary Saturday, the kind of day that feels unremarkable until you realize it was the last of its kind. Thank you, I managed to say. This means more than you know. Daniel would have wanted you to have it. He always said that the best teachers are the ones who care about more than just the lesson they're teaching. I placed the photograph on my workbench where I could see it while I worked. It would serve as a reminder of the man Daniel had been, of the love he'd shared with his son, and of the responsibility I'd inherited to help that love continue. As the weeks turned into months, the photograph became a touchstone for me. On difficult days, when nothing seemed to go right, I would look at it and remember why I did this work, not just to fix machines, but to fix the connections between people, to keep the important things running, to honor the promises that transcend death. Tommy's visits became more frequent and more purposeful. He was genuinely interested in learning about engines and transmissions, about the way things worked and how to fix them when they broke. But more than that, he was learning about patience and persistence, about the satisfaction that comes from solving problems and helping others. One cold December afternoon, as snow began to fall outside the garage, Tommy was helping me rebuild a carburetor when he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mr. Jack, do you think my dad can see me now?" I looked up from the carburetor, meeting his serious dark eyes. "What do you think?" "I think he can. I think he's proud of me for learning to fix things. I think he's happy that I'm helping people." "I think you're right." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes I talk to him when I'm working on something hard. I tell him about what I'm doing, and it feels like he's helping me figure it out. That's a good way to keep him close." "Do you talk to your dad?" The question surprised me. I'd mentioned my father to Tommy before, but only in passing. "Sometimes. He taught me most of what I know about being a mechanic. When I'm working on something particularly challenging, I sometimes hear his voice in my head, giving me advice." "What kind of advice?" I thought about it. "He used to say that every problem has a solution, you just have to be patient enough to find it. He said that rushing leads to mistakes, but taking your time leads to understanding." Tommy absorbed this wisdom with the gravity of someone much older than his years. My dad used to say something like that. He said that the best way to learn was to pay attention, to watch carefully, and to ask questions when you didn't understand something. "Your dad was a smart man." "I miss him," Tommy said quietly, "but I don't feel as sad as I used to. I feel like he's still teaching me things, just in a different way. I set down my tools and really looked at this remarkable child. In the months since his father's death, he'd grown in ways that went beyond physical height. He was more confident, more thoughtful, more aware of the world around him. The grief was still there, but it had been transformed into something else, a deeper appreciation for love, for connection, for the preciousness of time. "I think that's exactly what he's doing," I said. "I think he's still teaching you, still loving you, still helping you become the person he knew you could be." Tommy smiled, and for a moment I could see Daniel in his expression. The same warmth, the same quiet strength, the same capacity for love that transcended circumstance. That night, as I drove home through the falling snow, I thought about the mystery of grief and healing, how loss could become love, how endings could become beginnings, how the worst things that happen to us can sometimes lead to the best things we become. Tommy Miller had lost his father, but he'd gained something too, a deeper understanding of what it means to care for others, to use your talents in service of something larger than yourself, to find meaning in the simple act of fixing what's broken. The photograph on my workbench had become more than just a memory. It was a promise, a commitment to continue the work that Daniel had started, to help his son grow into the kind of man who would make the world a little bit better just by being in it. Some promises, I'd learned, are kept not through grand gestures, but through small daily acts of love, through staying late to fix a child's bicycle, through listening to a widow's fears, through teaching a grieving boy that broken things can be made whole again. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked up at the stars, barely visible through the falling snow. Somewhere in that vast expanse, I imagined Daniel Miller watching over his son, proud of the boy's courage, grateful for the community that had embraced his family, satisfied that his most important promise, to love his son unconditionally, was being kept by everyone who cared about Tommy. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look new and clean and full of possibility. Inside my house, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow accumulate on the branches of the old oak tree in my yard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new repairs, new opportunities to help. Tommy would probably stop by after school, eager to learn something new to help with whatever project I had going. Sarah would likely call to check on something, a strange noise in her car, a question about insurance, a simple need to talk to someone who understood. And I would be there, ready to help, ready to listen, ready to continue the work of keeping promises and fixing what's broken. Because that's what mechanics do. We keep things running, we solve problems, we make sure that the important connections between people, between past and future, between love and loss, remain strong and true. The snow fell softly outside my window, and inside I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done something that matters. I'd helped a child learn to ride again. I'd helped a family heal. I'd kept a promise that transcended death. And tomorrow I'd get up and do it all again, one repair at a time, one connection at a time, one promise at a time. Because in the end, that's what life is. A series of small acts of love, repeated daily, that add up to something beautiful and meaningful and lasting. The photograph of Daniel and Tommy sat on my workbench, frozen in a moment of joy and connection that would endure long after the snow had melted and the seasons had changed. It was a reminder that love never really dies, it just changes form, taking root in new hearts, inspiring new acts of kindness, creating new connections that span the distance between life and death, between memory and hope, between what was and what still might be.